The world has spent the last 24 hours processing what is the state of play after the seismic shift that was the Oval Office meltdown with Trump, Vance and Zelensky. Britain's Keir Starmer and France's Emmanuel Macron have a plan that they're putting together with President Zelensky. I think they're making the best of what they've got. Ultimately, I believe their plan is doomed to fail. So let's discuss. I went through yesterday what I believe happened in the Oval Office meltdown, which, to understand properly, you need to know the context of what came before and what both sides were looking to achieve. If you've not seen that video, I recommend it. Seems to have landed pretty well with a lot of those who have watched it, and it continues to fit the facts with what we've learned since, which I'll talk about more at the end of this video. In the aftermath of the blowout, there have been, as you would expect, strong reactions. European leaders and plenty of Americans, of course, just not the ones in charge, have been universally dismayed and are now trying to work out what can be salvaged. The MAGA faithful have been ecstatically feral at the delectable shreds of red meat that they've been thrown. Both reactions matter, but let's deal with the former right now. After leaving Washington, President Zelensky flew to Britain, where he was received warmly by the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer. This resulted in probably the first and could well be only time that Keir Starmer woke up in the morning to find that even the right-wing press were giving him positive front-page headlines. Even the Daily Mail, which had celebrated Trump's arrival back in the White House and pushed it in Starmer's face as being a big problem for him, well, that ran a front-page headline today asking if the invitation to Trump for a state visit could be rescinded. Heck, if you've lost the Daily Mail, something's definitely going on. Other European leaders gathered today, but the action that had been going on behind the scenes was hinted at by Starmer in an interview with the BBC's Laura Kuenssberg this morning. He had been on the phone, he said, to President Trump several times after the meltdown, seeking to smooth things over. Now, to work out exactly what's going on, you slightly have to read between the lines without getting too carried away, because everything that Starmer said in the interview was clearly said, bearing in mind that Trump would certainly get to hear the quotes, at least if he said anything that came across as too critical. His answers were identical to the message that they are sending privately to Trump. So, when asked what he thought of Trump's baseless assertions on this, that or the other, he had a clearly, carefully crafted line that was the one he repeated again and again.
My strong view is that he wants a lasting peace, and I agree with him about that.
This is attempted persuasion in action. Define the problem around a common area of agreement. Praise the other person for holding that position, and then work from there to persuade the other side that their interests are served best if they accept your definition of what it will take to bring the common goal to fruition. So he added to his phrase that Trump wants a lasting peace.
You can't have a deal that then falls apart. And that is what President Zelensky is worried about. He's pretty open about that. There was the Minsk deal, obviously, before. It didn't hold. And so President Zelensky is rightly concerned that if there's to be a deal, it has to hold. And that's why we've talked extensively about what are the guarantees.
The worst of all outcomes, he said,
is that there is a temporary pause and then Putin comes again.
In other words, Mr. President, you want there to be peace, but if you get a deal and then Putin does what he's done in the past, disregards that deal and comes again, it will make you look weak. Now, this is a good line in principle. It's going to fail, but we'll come to that in a moment. Remember what we said yesterday. Going into the White House meeting, Zelensky was aware that in the US-Russia summit in Riyadh, they had discussed a three-point plan that was very much on Russia's terms. 1. Immediate ceasefire, allowing Russia to recoup its forces. 2. Use the temporary peace to insist that Ukraine should hold elections, hoping to remove Zelensky and replace him with someone more pliant, or at any rate less experienced. 3. Only then start actual peace negotiations, with Russia more able to negotiate from even more strength. Hence why Zelensky was fixated on getting a security guarantee into anything that he signed with Trump, because what it looked like up until that point was that the US had become an adversary and was conspiring with Russia to weaken Ukraine. Now, Starmer and the Europeans still hope for a world where the US is persuaded not to full-scale embrace Russia's worldview at the expense of the democracies of the West. I think it's doomed to fail, but to be fair, they may have exactly the same assessment. They just recognise that they have to try. So this is why Starmer is trying to frame Trump's former statements as things he fully supports and agrees with, because he hopes that by reinforcing them with such approval, they might just stick into his version of what they should mean. Does he really believe what he says? He was clear that while some people, he said, were rushing off onto Twitter to spout off whatever it was they thought, his job was just to say and do what he believed would serve the interests of the nation. So no, he's not going to say what he thinks, that Trump is off his head. He's going to repeat the carefully crafted lines. When Kunsberg asked if the US had said it would guarantee the security of a peace deal, obvious answer no, Starmer clung to vague phrases and tried to imbue them with meaning.
I think you will have heard him in the press conference that we had being clear that he would always have our backs. That's been the situation for many, many years, and a very clear commitment to Article 5 of NATO.
Yeah, I wouldn't suggest you could take any of that to the bank, to be honest, but I can see why you would try. I'm giving him credit for trying to make this work. But would you trust Trump? Asked Kunsberg.
But if the central question you're putting to me is, do I trust Donald Trump when he says he wants lasting peace? The answer to that question is yes.
The real answer to this, of course, is obviously not in the slightest. I mean, we've seen this. Starmer had gone to great lengths with the preparation for his White House visit to try to manage the potential unpredictability of his host to avoid the sort of outcome that, happened to Zelensky. Not something you have to do with trusted allies. But the answer reverted to the agreed line. I trust Trump when he says that he wants lasting peace, he said. And he went on to stress the close relationship between the UK and the US. We trade together, we fought wars together, and so on. All stuff that it's not clear Trump cares much about, but we think that he should. So what's the programme that all the European leaders are discussing today? It starts from the premise that I described yesterday. The minerals deal that was failed to be signed was not a peace deal. It had no security guarantees built in, clearly by design. So European leaders must know, even if they're not going to say so in public, that Trump's original intention was hostile to Ukraine, and that therefore they have to persuade him not to let Zelensky back so they can sign that deal, but that they can provide a ceasefire deal that will work better for Trump than the Russia-approved version that he was previously on course to endorse. That is why Starmer and Macron have said their agreement is to work out the details of a peace plan, and they will then share that with the United States. That addresses some of the obstacles very effectively. Not effectively enough, but it's arguably mission impossible. Firstly, they know that Trump and Vance are triggered by Zelensky. By now, you could say without hubris that they hate Zelensky and wholly endorse Putin's aim of removing him from the negotiating field. Well, for this stage at least, Britain and France, as the two countries that successfully flattered Trump into a warm, fuzzy state last week, they can become the face and the representatives for this interim step, a ceasefire deal. That would make it more palatable for the White House to consider it seriously and provide some minimal cover for the Zelensky-hating MAGA commentariat. And that gives them the opportunity to spend real time and get real expert input on this question. If this process is going to move forward short term. How could it work in a way that would appeal to Trump, but that would provide cover for Ukraine as, the invaded party? This is being done on the presumption that it's way preferable for Europe to partly bring the US on side than it is to have the US go full-on hostile towards Ukraine and simply sign up hook, line and sinker to Russia's version, as they've shown every sign of intending to do since Riyadh. And it's hard to argue that they're wrong to see that as preferable. The US moving into full hostile positioning would make Ukraine's future pretty bleak under most scenarios. But I do think it's going to be impossible to bridge, for the same reason that Trump's approach was also never going to be successful. Why? Because Putin isn't going to play. Why would he? Putin wanted the United States to pull all support from Ukraine so that he could more quickly and methodically achieve his original maximalist goals. He might well have signed up for a ceasefire as part of that. He would have embraced the opportunity to use that to try and get rid of Zelensky. But if he failed to get his puppets to replace him, which is highly likely because Ukrainians don't much like Putin, he would easily have come up with an excuse, a rigged election probably, the most obvious one, enabling him to restart his push to take the country. That's a likely outcome for Trump's preferred, Russia-preferred strategy. It ends up making Trump look like a chump, although, of course, he and his acolytes would find ways to blame it on everyone else but themselves. But Putin will simply refuse to accept any alternative plan that Europe and Ukraine comes up with. His Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has been laying the ground for this, praising Trump's approach and slating Europe for seeking to continue the conflict. By continue the conflict, read continue to resist being invaded. Trump will therefore not accept it, with or without Zelensky fronting it, because he'd say at least his version might get Putin actually to the table. And once he's there, then a deal can be negotiated. But if you can't get him to the table, then a deal can't happen by definition. And it's kind of one of the things he said during the blowout argument. Putin will happily feed that self-delusion if it serves to undermine any credibility or potential for a more robust peace protest that would actually hold Russia to account for its actions. I don't see how Britain and France and Ukraine and whoever else can come up with a plan that avoids that very basic roadblock. Before the meltdown, you could have hoped to persuade Trump that the roadblock to peace was actually Putin. Probably that would have failed, but you had a better chance. You only have to have heard him go on since about how terrible Zelensky is for saying all those nasty things about Putin all the time to know that it's not going to work anymore. This weekend, we saw an interview in Russia with Dmitry Peskov, where he said that Donald Trump's Ukraine policy, quote, largely coincides with Vladimir Putin's. Time used to be that would be an embarrassing statement for the US administration of the day, but with the MAGA crowd now, it will be worn as a bizarre badge of honour. Such is the power of decades of Russian disinformation on the American body politic. By the way, since yesterday, we've had more feedback from White House officials that rather support the version of what happened in the meltdown that I shared here yesterday. Those officials are saying that the US had made it clear to Zelensky in advance they wanted to negotiate security guarantees later, after the minerals deal had been signed. Hence why they reacted the way they did when Zelensky pursued arguing for why such guarantees were needed in the deal itself. Now, if Zelensky had believed there was a genuine willingness for such guarantees, he would, of course, have been ill-advised to push that case. But clearly, he had seen the US-Russian three-point plan as the rest of us had, and simply saw that the US was asking him to sign a deal to enrich America from Ukrainian minerals in a way that would present no obstacle to then pursuing Russia's preferred course. He would have realised he would be a mug to sign on that basis. He did not believe that they intended to offer security guarantees afterwards, and so he took the risk of pushing the case in front of the media. Remember what he had said previously about how Trump had been surrounded by a disinformation bubble. Hence, there he was, telling him about the kidnapped children, showing him the photos of prisoners of war, trying, however forlornly, to use the opportunity to try to break through that bubble and get him to see some of the reality of the Putin that Trump is inclined to praise. Hence why the administration pushed back and hit the abort button on the whole operation in the way that we saw. Right now, MAGA world has cemented itself into an anti-Zelensky and anti-Ukraine position. The reaction of the base helps Trump and Vance to believe they made a smart move. They can believe their own hubris, that they socked it to Zelensky, stood up to him, and so on and so on. The Europeans who think the way forward is to persuade Zelensky to, quote, swallow his pride and go back to the White House for a second helping, they are missing two things. The first is the whole dynamic that I've described here. The minerals deal that didn't get signed is not what needs to be rescued. And second, given the vicious delight of the base, given the thin-skinned offendedness of Trump, the degree of humiliation that would be demanded of Zelensky for a second visit would be off the charts. Worth doing on behalf of your country if it's actually going to save you from Putin's invaders. Not so much just because some Europeans are still hoping that if you flatter Trump enough, he'll give us the old rules-based world order back. No, he won't.